None of this is about love, and you know it.
Brianna Greco begged to be bought. That night, her own father would auction off her virginity to the elite that controlled the city. Desperate, she sought out the only man powerful enough to stop it, Alexei Volkov, her family's enemy, and the man she had secretly loved for years. But when the bedroom door closed after the wedding, she realized she had gotten everything wrong. Alexei held her veil between his fingers, looked her directly in the eyes, and said, with devastating calm, "Take off that dress. This marriage is not about love." What Brianna didn't know yet was that she hadn't been saved. She was the final piece of a revenge plan. Chapter 1. She went to ask for help from the only man who had every reason to destroy her. There are decisions we make with absolute clarity, knowing we're going to regret them, and we make them anyway, because the alternative is worse than any regret could ever be. I was standing in front of the door to Alexei Volkov's office with my heart in my throat, and the Greco pride swallowed so deep I could barely breathe. There was no invitation, no warning. There was only me, my name opening doors where no other Greco would dare knock, and the full awareness that I was about to do the most reckless thing I had ever done in my life. The assistant who had received me on the upper floor was still looking at me with the expression of someone who didn't know whether to block me or escort me, and I used exactly that hesitation to cross the room and place my hand on the doorknob before he could find the answer. I pushed the door open. Alexei had his back to me when I walked in, standing before the glass that covered the entire wall of his office, and offered the city below like a gift. He didn't turn around right away, and that detail, so small, so calculated, was already enough to remind me who I was dealing with. I knew his reputation before I ever knew his face. Everyone in our world did. Alexei Volkov was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice for the entire room to feel the weight of his presence. And when he finally turned around, slow and unhurried, like someone who had just decided I deserved his attention, I understood in practice what the stories had always tried to describe. His eyes found mine with a precision that made me want to take a step back. I didn't. A Greco doesn't back down, at least not in front of anyone. He said nothing. He simply observed me, head to toe, with the cold detachment of someone running a calculation you have no access to, and then returned to my face as if the result was still up in the air. 3 days earlier, my father had called me into his office in a voice I had never heard at that frequency. It wasn't the voice of a patriarch. It was the voice of a man who was afraid, and was trying to hide it behind the frame of whatever power he still had left. Ettore Greco looked at me from across the desk and said, with a composure I recognized as rehearsed, that the family's debts had started closing in faster than expected, that certain financial commitments needed to be resolved before they became a scandal, and that there was a way to handle everything at once, pay what needed to be paid, reinforce alliances, and keep the Greco name intact. I listened, and then he told me what that way was. I stared at him for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. That kind of silence where the brain processes the information, and the body hasn't yet understood that it needs to react. An auction, my virginity, a list of men willing to pay for it, and the highest bid would win not just the night, but the marriage, the ring, and access to the Greco name as collateral for a contract my father desperately needed to sign. I looked at him as if I had never seen this man before in my life, and in that moment I realized I might never truly have. Back in Alexei's office, with the weight of those full 3 days pressing against my back, I kept my chin up, and my voice steady when I finally spoke. "I know you have no reason to see me," I said, and my voice came out more stable than I had expected. "And I know my name isn't exactly welcome here, but I came anyway because you're the only man in this city with enough power to change what's about to happen to me in the next few days." Alexei didn't respond right away. He moved toward the desk, slowly, and leaned against the edge with his arms crossed, and that posture that seemed to say time was a resource that belonged to him alone. His eyes didn't leave my face. "Go on," he said, finally. His voice was low and completely controlled, the kind that didn't need volume to fill an entire room. I took a deep breath. "My father is going to auction me off." I said the word plainly, because I had spent the last 3 days trying to find a softer way to say it, and had come to the conclusion that there wasn't one. "There's a list of interested men, and whoever bids the highest wins not just a night, but a marriage and a contract with the Greco family. I've seen some of the names on that list, and I'd rather not think about what it would mean to end up with any of them. There were men on that list that would have me choosing a convent. Gladly. You need a wife," I continued, before he had time to say something that would make me lose my train of thought. "I know that. Everyone knows the Volkovs require the Pakan to be married before he can take full command, and I would be a perfect wife for what you need. Presence at events, dinners, public engagements, and complete loyalty for as long as the arrangement lasts. In exchange, you get me out of this situation before it happens. The silence that followed had texture. It was the kind of silence where you feel every second passing against your skin, while trying not to show just how scared you are. Alexei looked at me with an expression I couldn't categorize. It wasn't anger, it wasn't surprise, and it definitely wasn't the immediate rejection I had prepared myself to receive. It was something closer to interest, the cold and calculated kind I imagined he applied to anything that might be useful to him, and that, somehow, was more unsettling than anything he could have said. The corner of his mouth moved. It didn't quite become a smile, but it was close enough to be more frightening than any verbal response. It was the movement of someone who had just found exactly what they were looking for, in a place they hadn't expected to find anything. My stomach turned, because I had loved him for years. That was the secret I carried more carefully than any other, one I had buried so deep that sometimes I could pretend to myself it didn't exist. And now I was here, asking for help from the man who had every reason in the world to destroy me along with my family, betting that his strategic interest would outweigh the hatred he had for the name I carried. It was the riskiest bet I had ever made in my life, and I had no other card to play. Alexei pushed off the desk with the ease of someone who had never lost control of anything, and walked back to the window, but this time at an angle, without taking me entirely out of his line of sight. He was quiet for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were, and then looked at me straight on with an expression that was nearly impossible to read. When he finally spoke, his voice came out with the surgical precision of someone who had weighed every word before releasing it. "How much does your father want as a starting bid?" Chapter 2. She bought her own cage, and he designed every bar. I wasn't in the room when the auction took place. That was the only concession my father had given me, not having to be present while men I had known since childhood negotiated my future around a table, as if they were discussing the acquisition of a company and not a person's life. I stayed in the room they had assigned me on the upper floor, hands in my lap and shoulders straight, because a Greco doesn't show what they feel, and I had learned that before I learned how to ride a bike, but I could hear. Not the words, not the numbers. The acoustics of the hallway didn't give me that level of detail. What reached me was the tone, the low murmur of male voices discussing things at a slow, deliberate rhythm, like men in no hurry because the outcome was already guaranteed one way or another. That sound was enough to make me understand, with a clarity no explanation could surpass, exactly what I was to these people in that moment. A transaction. I breathed deeply and kept my eyes fixed on the wall in front of me, because it was the only thing I could control right then. The meeting lasted 43 minutes. I know because I counted every single one. When the door downstairs opened and footsteps began spreading through the hallway, my heart sped up in a way I recognized as panic, and refused to name as such. I had made a decision 2 days earlier, when I left Alexei Volkov's office with the answer I needed, and more questions than I'd walked in with. I had calculated every variable. I had weighed the risks with the same precision I used to analyze the financial statements of my father's empire. And even so, when the bedroom door opened and my father's assistant appeared with that expression, that was neither good news nor bad news, just information, my stomach sank in a way no calculation had predicted. "The final bid has been placed," he said, with the professional neutrality of someone who had delivered that kind of message more times than he should have. "Miss Brianna, your father is asking that you come downstairs." I stood up slowly, straightened my coat, and went down. My father was standing in the center of the room with an expression that was a mix of relief and something I refused to identify as shame, because if I did, I wouldn't be able to keep looking at him the same way. Beside him were two men I recognized as part of the Volkov inner circle, discreet, well-dressed, with that specific posture of men who exist to resolve problems without making noise. And at the center of it all, hands clasped behind his back, and eyes fixed on me from the moment I walked in, was Alexei. He wore a dark suit without a tie, and had the expression of someone who had just concluded a negotiation, exactly as expected. There was no triumph on his face, no visible satisfaction, none of the arrogance I had prepared myself to encounter. There was only that absolute calm I had already learned to recognize as the most dangerous form of silence, the kind that doesn't need words because he already knows exactly what comes next. His eyes found mine, and I needed every bit of self-control I had developed in 24 years of carrying the Greco name to keep from looking away. "It's done," my father said, in a voice that was trying to sound firm, and only managed to sound tired. "The contract will be signed tomorrow morning. The ceremony takes place next week." I said nothing. I simply held Alexei's gaze for 1 second longer than was reasonable, then turned and walked back upstairs to my room, because a Greco doesn't show what they feel. And what I was feeling in that moment was not for anyone to see. The ceremony was small and cold and entirely functional. The kind that exists to fulfill a formality and not to be remembered fondly. There were no guests beyond the witnesses required by the courthouse, and a handful of people from each family who needed to be present for the contract to carry the weight it needed to carry. Irina was there. She was the only thing that kept me from completely unraveling in the week leading up to all of this. With her sharp humor and the quiet loyalty she never put into words because we both knew she didn't have to. When she saw me ready, she looked me up and down with that expression only she had, half ironic, half emotional, completely unable to choose between the two, and said only, "You look ridiculously beautiful for a wedding you're pretending you don't want." I didn't answer, but I laughed, and it was the last time I laughed without heaviness that day. The dress was white and flawless, the kind that seemed made for the body of the person wearing it, and not the other way around. The flowers were white too, lilies, because I had insisted on it, and no one had questioned it, and I needed at least one thing that day that was truly mine. My hair was pinned up with a few loose strands framing my face, and I had looked at myself in the mirror before leaving and thought, with the particular cruelty we reserve only for ourselves, what a shame it has to be like this, because I had dreamed of a wedding. Not like this, not this way, not for this reason, not with all this coldness surrounding it, but I had dreamed, and I had imagined, more times than I would ever admit, that the man on the other side could be him, and now he was there, and I was there, and neither of us was exactly where we wanted to be, only for entirely different reasons. The courthouse had that tired, yellowish light that flatters no one, and the officiant who conducted the ceremony spoke at the pace of someone who had done it hundreds of times, and had stopped finding it meaningful long ago. The words washed over me as if they were in another language. I heard them, but the meaning arrived a few seconds late, filtered through a layer of unreality I couldn't dissolve no matter how hard I tried. Alexei stood beside me throughout the entire ceremony, with that posture he seemed incapable of abandoning. Shoulders straight, jaw set, gaze forward. He was tall enough that I had to tilt my chin slightly upward when I looked at him, and in that moment, I resented that detail in a way that was completely disproportionate to the situation. When it came time for the vows, he said yes, with the same voice I imagined he used to sign contracts, firm, final, and without any hesitation that could be interpreted as emotion. I said yes too, and somewhere inside me, in a part I knew had no right to exist in that context, something shifted, because it was him, it was Alexei. And even though everything around us was cold and calculated, and entirely devoid of romance, the concrete fact was that I had said yes to the man I had loved for longer than I cared to count, and that, no matter how irrational it was, no matter how clearly I knew it was dangerous to think this way, settled inside me with a weight that wasn't just a contract. The witnesses signed. The documents were organized. People began dispersing with that quiet efficiency of those who had done what they came to do and had no reason to stay. I was talking with Irina in a low voice. She had just murmured something about needing a glass of wine with surgical urgency, which was her way of saying she was processing all of this. When I felt Alexei's presence behind me before he even spoke, it was a physical thing. His presence. Something that occupied space in a way I still hadn't found the vocabulary to describe adequately. Irina looked at me again, and then looked at the point just past my shoulder with an expression that was the human version of an exclamation mark, and covered it by picking up a glass from the nearest table with completely unnecessary focus. I turned around. Alexei was less than a foot away from me, and the closeness was enough for me to catch his cologne, something subtle and dry that I had noticed in his office 2 days before, and that my brain had filed away without asking my permission. His eyes were on my face, and there was an expression there I couldn't fully decode. It wasn't tender, it wasn't cold, it was something between the two that left me more unsettled than either one alone would have managed. He leaned in slightly, and his voice came low enough to exist only between the two of us, low enough that no one else in the room could hear, even if they tried. Take off the wedding dress. A pause of exactly 1 second, precise and deliberate. This marriage is not about love. I looked at him, and the smile that had existed at the corner of my mouth, small, involuntary, the kind that appears when you're trying to convince yourself you're okay, slowly faded, like a light someone dimmed in slow motion, instead of all at once, because all at once would have been too fast to hurt this much. He wasn't being cruel. That was the part that hit me harder than I had anticipated. He wasn't being cruel. He wasn't trying to hurt me. There was no satisfaction in those words whatsoever. It was simply the truth, delivered with the same matter-of-factness with which he had signed the documents minutes before. A man managing expectations within an agreement, so there would be no misunderstandings down the line. I was the agreement. The veil was in his hands. I hadn't even noticed he had reached for the fabric, but there it was, between his long fingers, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to do, and his eyes hadn't left mine, waiting with a patience that was almost worse than impatience would have been. I took one slow breath, In a way, I hoped he didn't notice. "I heard you the first time," I said, in a voice that came out colder than I felt, and which I was proud of in the way that only makes sense when you're trying to keep yourself standing. He didn't respond. He simply made an almost imperceptible movement with his head. It wasn't agreement. It wasn't approval. It was the gesture of someone who had registered the information and moved on, and stepped away with that absolute calm that was starting to irritate me in a way I recognized as dangerous. Because when Alexei Volkov irritated me, it was because he had gotten too close to something I didn't want him to see. Irina appeared at my side 2 seconds later, with the glass of wine she had grabbed, and an expression that held an absurd number of things at once. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood there, looking at the spot where Alexei had been. Then, in a low voice, and with the seriousness she only used when things were genuinely serious, "Brianna, don't," I answered, before she could finish. "I didn't even say anything. I know what you were going to say." She handed me the glass. I drank. The wine was good. That detail reached me with a clarity completely disproportionate to the moment, and I decided it was because the brain sometimes chooses the most wrong details to focus on when it's trying not to process what is actually happening. I had married Alexei Volkov. He had bought me with the composure of someone acquiring a rare piece of art that would occupy just the right place in the decor, and had made it absolutely clear, in a quiet voice and without a shred of cruelty, that that was exactly what I was to him: a piece, functional, necessary, well chosen, but just a piece. And the part of me that had said yes in that room with something resembling hope was now sitting very still somewhere deep inside, in a place I had decreed, in that exact second, needed to be locked carefully, so the rest of me could keep functioning, because I had made a mistake that hadn't been in my calculations. I had forgotten for a moment that loving someone doesn't mean that someone has any reason to love you back. Chapter 3. She promised to be the perfect wife. Nobody warned him what that meant. Brianna Greco doesn't cry. She reorganizes. That was a rule I had established for myself, long before it became a real necessity, before the auction, before the wedding, before Alexei Volkov looked at me with that devastating calm and made it clear that I was a tool and not a person in that arrangement. I had learned early on that crying was a luxury that cost more than it was worth, and that the energy spent feeling could be redirected toward acting. So, the morning after the wedding, I woke up in the room I had been assigned in Alexei's apartment, spacious, impersonal, and decorated with the precise taste of someone who chooses everything with careful criteria and feels nothing about the result, stared at the ceiling for exactly 2 minutes, and then got up. There was an agreement to fulfill, and I was going to fulfill it so well that he wouldn't know what to do with me. The plan was simple in theory, and absolutely insane in practice, which, in retrospect, should have given me a clue about how things were going to unfold. Perfect wife. That was what I had promised Alexei in the proposal, and that was what I intended to deliver, except my definition of perfect, and the definition he had imagined upon hearing that word were, I would discover in the weeks that followed, completely different in practically every conceivable way. To me, perfect wife meant coffee at 72 degrees Celsius, because studies show that's the temperature at which the aromatic compounds are at their peak. The schedule organized far enough in advance to anticipate conflicts, flawless presence at any social event, and above all, opinions. Delivered with conviction, backed by data, and offered without waiting for an invitation, because if I saw something wrong, I said so, and the fact that no one had asked for my perspective was a detail I considered irrelevant given the usefulness of the information. Alexei, I suspected, had imagined something more along the lines of elegant silence and decorative presence. He discovered, within the first week, that he had bought something else entirely. The first time I saw him genuinely without an answer was during a meeting with his financial advisor, a man named Dmitry, who was competent in everything except noticing when the numbers in a projection didn't add up, because the underlying assumption was wrong. I was sitting 2 seats down from Alexei, technically there only as a presence, wife at events, the agreement had said, and that meeting counted as an event under my personal interpretation of the contract, when Dmitry presented a quarterly projection with a conceptual error so obvious that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stay quiet for exactly 40 seconds. I didn't make it to 40 seconds. "Excuse me," I said, in a completely neutral and polite tone, because there was no reason to be rude. This projection assumes linear growth along a curve that the market itself has signaled as logarithmic over the past 2 quarters. The final number is approximately 30% above what the trend can support. The silence that followed was the specific kind where several people are processing the same thing at the same time, and none of them are sure what the right response to the situation is. Dmitry looked at me, then looked at Alexei, then looked back at the numbers, and I saw on his face the exact moment he realized I was right. Alexei said nothing, but I felt the weight of his gaze settle on me with a different quality than all the other looks he had given me up to that point. It wasn't the calculation from before. It wasn't the usual coldness. It was something else, which I filed away without being able to name it, and without having time to investigate because Dmitri had started revising the numbers out loud, and the meeting continued. It was only when we were leaving, when the hallway left us momentarily alone, that Alexei said, without slowing his pace or turning his face fully toward me, "Where did you learn to read market projections?" "Managing my father's empire's finances since I was 19. I replied, with the same neutrality he had used. This time the silence was different from the ones before it. It wasn't the silence of someone calculating. It was the silence of someone revising a conclusion they had already considered settled. He didn't respond, but his pace slowed slightly, just enough for us to continue side by side instead of him one step ahead of me, as it had been up until then. I filed that detail away too. Life in the apartment had its own logic, which I was learning to map with the same attention I devoted to any other system I needed to understand in order to function within it. Alexei woke up early, worked in absolute silence until 8, had coffee in the same spot every morning, and read the day's reports with a focus that made any interruption feel like a transgression of almost physical magnitude. I interrupted anyway, because I had realized that the only way to exist in that apartment without becoming completely invisible was to actively take up space. "You scheduled 2 meetings at the same time on Thursday," I said on the third morning, walking past him with my cup and sliding the tablet with his calendar toward him without stopping. "The dinner with the Petrovs needs to be moved to 8, or you'll have to leave one meeting in the middle to make it to the other on time, and that's going to look like calculated rudeness when it's probably just an administrative oversight." Alexei looked at the tablet, then looked at me. "You reorganize my schedule. I flagged a conflict in your schedule," I corrected, with a precision that was completely genuine, and I could tell from the subtle movement of his jaw, mildly irritating. "I only reorganize if you confirm you want me to." "Reorganize it," he said after a beat. "Already done," I replied, and I kept walking toward the kitchen while hearing, behind me, the specific silence of a man deciding how to categorize what had just happened. The first unplanned touch happened one evening when we were both in his office, reviewing a contract he had asked for my opinion on, a request that came with the naturalness of someone trying out a new habit and not yet sure how they feel about it. I was standing beside him, leaning over the desk with the document in front of me, when I pointed out a problematic clause, and my hand came to rest on the table a few inches from his. Neither of us moved. I kept talking about the clause, because there was a problematic clause that needed to be discussed, and the fact that I had suddenly become very aware of the distance between our fingers was my own personal problem, and not a reason to stop. But the rhythm of what I was saying shifted, just slightly, enough for me to know it had shifted, and enough to make me angry at myself for it. Alexei said nothing, but when I glanced to the side, his focus wasn't entirely on the document. I moved my hand away with a casualness that required more effort than it should have, and returned to the previous paragraph as if nothing had happened. He did the same, and the silence that remained between us after that was different from all the other silences of those weeks. It wasn't neutral, it wasn't calculated, it was loaded with something neither of us had named, and neither of us seemed to have any intention of naming anytime soon. Dangerous, I thought, while pretending I was reading the next paragraph a second time because I wanted to, and not because I had completely lost the thread on the first pass. This is very dangerous. Chapter 4. He was using her. Nobody warned his heart. There was a very clear logic to the way Alexei steered conversations about the Greco family's business. It took me a few weeks to notice it, and I only noticed because I'm exactly the kind of person who picks up on patterns in systems that weren't designed to be transparent. His questions were always natural, always embedded within a larger context, always arriving at the moment when my guard was low enough for me to answer with the same naturalness with which he asked, never direct enough to raise suspicion, never frequent enough to feel like an interrogation. It was elegant. I would have admired the technique if I weren't the one it was being used on, but in those weeks I hadn't yet reached that conclusion. In those weeks, I simply answered, about my father's contract structures, about the alliances that sustained the Greco Empire, about Marco and the businesses he managed, with the openness of someone who is building trust within an agreement, and dangerously mistakes that for something closer to intimacy. What I hadn't calculated was the notebook. I had been carrying it for months, before the auction, before the wedding, before anything that had to do with Alexei. It was an ordinary notebook on the outside, the kind that draws no attention on any surface, but inside it contained everything I had quietly gathered, with a patience that had cost me more than I cared to admit, about the death of Natasha Volkov, the sister-in-law I had never gotten to know well, but whose story didn't close in any way I could accept as definitive. My brother's wife, who had died in a way that made no sense, whose case had been closed with a speed that made even less sense, and whose name I sometimes heard in conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room, which was, in and of itself, enough to tell me there was something there that someone didn't want me to see. I kept the notebook with a care disproportionate to the object itself, and if Alexei had noticed that, he hadn't said anything, which, I was beginning to realize, was exactly how he operated. Observing without revealing he was observing, registering without signaling that he had registered. We were alike in that way. I just didn't know yet that this was a problem. The shift in rhythm happened on an ordinary Tuesday with nothing special to justify what took place in it. We were reviewing contracts, as we had done several nights during those weeks, and the conversation had drifted from the documents into something looser, the kind of conversation that happens when two people spend enough time together for the silence between topics to stop feeling strange and start feeling natural. He had said something about a poorly handled negotiation he had witnessed years ago, and I had responded with a similar case I had fixed for my father at 20, and somewhere in that exchange he had said, without any preamble, and in a voice slightly different from his usual, "You're the most intelligent person I've ever worked with." I looked at him. He didn't appear to be expecting a specific reaction. There was no visible calculation in the statement, no declared intention. It was simply an observation delivered with the same precision with which he said everything, and perhaps it was exactly that naturalness that completely disarmed me. I laughed. A short, nervous, entirely involuntary laugh, the kind that surfaces when the body reacts before the brain has a chance to stop it. Alexei looked at me with an expression I couldn't categorize in the moment, but which I recorded with a fidelity that bothered me greatly afterward, when I had time to think about it. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered they wanted to hear that sound again, and was, for the first time in a long while, surprised by their own wanting. I looked back down at the contracts. He did the same, but neither of our shoulders quite returned to where they had been before. It was that same week that Ivan showed up at the family dinner. The dinner was one of those events that exist under the appearance of normalcy and carry, beneath it, a tension that only the right people can feel. My father had organized everything with the care of someone trying to demonstrate that the marriage had stabilized the relations between the families, and had invited the closest Grecos so that Alexei could meet them in a context that was meant to feel informal. Ivan arrived 20 minutes late with the perfect excuse, the kind that is elaborate enough to sound spontaneous. He was like that. Ivan always had the right thing to say at the right moment, always with the open smile and the manners of someone raised to be liked by everyone, and who had never had to try very hard to pull it off. I had known him my whole life. He was my cousin, my father's right-hand man, a constant presence at every family event, and I admired him, in the detached and functional way you admire someone who is good at what they do, without ever asking yourself what exactly drives that competence. That night, though, something was different. It wasn't anything I could name right away. It was an accumulation of small details that, separately, meant nothing, but together created a pattern my brain began registering, without my having asked it to. The way he looked at me, when he seemed to be looking in another direction. The question he asked about Alexei's apartment, subtle, worked into a conversation about neighborhoods, which revealed an interest in the location that had no apparent reason to exist. The attention he paid to what I said, just a little too intense to be mere cousin curiosity. I felt something off, not as a certainty. There was nothing concrete enough for that. It was just a slight discomfort, almost instinctive, triggered by the way he looked at me for 1 second longer than normal. A small detail, easy to dismiss in any other situation. Still, something about that look stayed with me for a moment, but it wasn't the time, and I had no real reason to question anything. So I smiled, answered his questions, and filed the feeling away in the mental space where I keep small oddities, the ones that might not mean anything, until one day they do. Alexei noticed. I only knew because on the way home, he said in the car, without context and without looking at me, "You went quiet at dinner around 10:30. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with the precision of someone who had registered the exact time and was simply confirming that I had also noticed what he had noticed. I was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to reveal. "I'm processing some things," I said finally, with the calculated vagueness of someone who doesn't want to close a door but isn't ready to open it either. He didn't push. He just looked straight ahead, jaw slightly set, fingers relaxed on the steering wheel, and said nothing more until we arrived. But that night, after the apartment had fallen silent, and I was back at the notebook with the desk lamp keeping me company, I realized something. Alexei had noticed the shift in me at the exact moment it had happened, with an attentiveness no man in my life had ever devoted to watching me, and that this frightened me in an entirely different way, for reasons I preferred, for now, not to examine too closely. Dangerous, I thought, for the second time in those weeks. All of this is very dangerous. Chapter 5. She heard the wrong half of the conversation. and the right half was exactly the one that changed everything. There was a version of Alexei Volkov the world didn't know. The world saw the Pakhan, controlled, polished, cold enough to silence a room simply by walking into it. But sometimes, small cracks appeared in that perfect surface, pauses that ran a little too long, a gaze that drifted for a second, the absent-minded gesture of his fingers tapping the table when he thought no one was watching. I was always watching. So that night, when he stopped mid-sentence on a contract, and went quiet in a way that was different from all his other silences, I said nothing. I just waited. The rain fell steadily outside, filling the apartment with the kind of stillness that seems to wrap itself around everything. The documents were spread across the table. Hours had passed without either of us noticing, and the distance between us had been shrinking little by little, almost without intention. It was in that silence, rain, papers, the air thick with something neither of us was naming, that he began to talk about Natasha. No introduction, no transition, as if the story had been unfolding inside him for too long and finally needed somewhere to go. "She was your brother's wife," he said, his voice low and his eyes fixed on a point beyond the rain-streaked window. "But before that, she was my sister, the only thing in the world that made me human." I already knew that. I had known it for months. It was part of the weight I carried in the notebook, part of the reason I had been quietly investigating, while everyone else assumed the blame lay with Marco. I had started investigating because Marco couldn't have done it. But the more I looked at the documents, the more I realized that death hadn't been an isolated accident. Natasha Volkov had married my brother out of love, against both families' wishes, and had died in a way that had never added up for me, no matter how many times I reread the official report. But hearing Alexei talk about her was different from knowing. He said there was something about Natasha, a lightness he had never been able to adequately describe, that made the weight of everything he carried feel a little more distributed, as if her presence alone was enough to make the air seem less dense. He said that after she died, the silence in the apartment had a specific quality he hadn't been able to put into words for anyone until then. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of something that had given sound its meaning. "I spent 2 years believing your brother had taken her from me," he continued, still not looking at me, and his voice had an almost imperceptible fracture that I caught because I was listening with my full attention. 2 years carrying that as certainty. I didn't respond, because there were things I knew and couldn't yet say, and there were things I felt in that moment and didn't yet have the courage to name. My hand landed on his before I had made the decision to put it there. It wasn't calculated. It was the natural movement of someone sitting beside a person in real pain, whose instinct arrives before any rational filter can. My fingers touched his on the table and stayed there. No pressure, no movement, simply present. Alexei looked at our hands for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and there was an expression on his face I'd never seen before. Not the coldness, not the calculation, not any of the versions of him I had spent weeks learning to map. It was something older, more bare. Neither of us spoke for a stretch of time I can't measure. The rain continued outside, and the only light on was the lamp in the corner of the office, casting a low, yellowish glow over everything and making the shadows softer than they usually were. I was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand beneath mine, and of the distance between our faces, and of the fact that my heart had sped up in a way I had no vocabulary to justify as anything other than exactly what it was. Alexei turned his hand slowly, not to pull it away, but so that his fingers found mine differently, more deliberately, like someone making a small and irreversible decision at the same time. His thumb passed once along the side of my hand, slowly, and I needed a disproportionate amount of self-control to keep breathing at the right pace. "You're the only person," he said, his voice even lower than before. "I can't read completely." I raised my eyes to his face. "You read me all the time," I replied, and my voice came out softer than I had intended, without the edges I usually kept as a safe distance. "I read what you decide to show." His gaze didn't leave mine. "Those are different things." The space between us had narrowed in a way I hadn't been monitoring, which was unusual for me, because I monitored everything. But there were moments when the body made decisions before the mind finished deliberating, and this was clearly one of those moments, because by the time I noticed, the distance between us was already only a few inches, and his hand had left the table to rest, with an almost cautious lightness, against the side of my face. His fingers touched my cheek as though I were something that could break, and that gentleness from a man I had seen intimidate an entire room with nothing but a look hit me with a force that hadn't been accounted for in any calculation I had made about that night. I didn't pull back, and that non-action was, in itself, an answer. The kiss was slow, deliberate, the kind that doesn't apologize for existing. He didn't pull me in, didn't press forward. He simply closed the remaining distance between us with that absolute calm that was characteristic of him in everything. And when his lips met mine, there was a quiet firmness in that touch, that disarmed me in a way no urgency could have managed. I had imagined, in the more honest moments of the past few weeks, what it would be like. But my imagination hadn't accounted for the warmth, or the way his fingers lightly held my chin to tilt the angle between us, or the way he kissed as though he had unlimited time and every intention of using each second of it. When he pulled back for the first time, it was only enough to look at me, to look. His eyes moved over my face with an attentiveness that made me feel simultaneously exposed and completely safe, which was a combination I hadn't experienced before and didn't know where to put except at the center of my chest, where it settled with a weight that was warm and frightening at the same time. "I need you to know," he said, his voice low and different from every other version of it I knew, rougher and more honest than usual, "that this isn't the agreement." I looked at him. "I know," I replied, and I did know, in a way that didn't need any more explanation than that. He guided me to the bedroom with a hand at the small of my back, a light touch that still moved through me entirely, because there was intention in it, and direction, and an unspoken promise that I chose, consciously and without regret, to receive. The bedroom was dark, except for the city light coming through the wide window, and he turned on the nightstand lamp with a gesture that was, for some reason, one of the most intimate moments of the entire night, as if he wanted to see me, and wanted me to know he wanted to. I remember the details in the fragmented and intensely sensory way that memory preserves things that truly matter. I remember the moment his fingers found the back of my dress, slow, steady, and the way he waited, lips near my shoulder, and his breath warm against my skin, until my body had fully relaxed before he continued. I remember the warmth of his hands moving over my waist as if he were learning a new geography with complete attention. No rush, like someone with no intention of forgetting what they were discovering. I remember the texture of his shirt under my fingers when I finally reached for his buttons myself, and the way he held his breath, just once, just for a second. When my hands touched his skin for the first time, there was something deeply equal in the way he touched me, as if the power he carried in every other context of his life had been, in that room, completely set aside, and what remained was simply a man who wanted to make one specific woman feel like the most important thing in the world in that moment, and he succeeded. With a quiet competence and an attention to detail I hadn't imagined finding in him, he succeeded. He stopped once in the middle of everything, braced above me, eyes on my face, and an expression that was the most honest I had seen from him since the beginning. "Are you okay?" he said, in a low voice. There was a tenderness in that simple question that I didn't know where to place. I had no drawer for it, no space reserved in my internal system for receiving gentleness from Alexei Volkov, and the absence of that drawer meant his tenderness landed directly in the center of my chest, with nothing to cushion it. "I am," I answered, and it was true in a way that frightened me, because I was okay, in a way I hadn't planned to be, hadn't imagined was possible in that marriage, in that arrangement, in that apartment that had been a cage, and that on that rainy night had become something else entirely. When he said my name, not Miss Greco, not with distance or calculation, but Brianna, just that, in that low and rough voice I had never heard any man use before, something inside me came undone in a way that was silent, complete, and absolutely irreversible. That night was the first time in my life I felt completely seen, not Ettore Greco's daughter, not the Empire's financial manager, not the piece in the arrangement, just me, with all my layers, contradictions, and the years of love I had kept so carefully, being looked at and touched and received by a man who had decided, at least for those hours, that I was enough exactly as I was. I was still carrying that look when, much later, I got up quietly while he slept. It was in the hallway that I heard it. His voice reached me through the open space between the hallway and the office, low, but carrying the firmness of someone reporting results to someone who had been waiting for them. I stopped before I understood why, with the empty glass in my hand, and that familiar pressure behind my sternum that precedes reason and always arrives with good reason. I got the information about the Grecos through her. The glass went still in my hand. When I expose everything, they'll be ruined. The plan is going exactly the way I wanted. I heard those words twice, once with my ears and a second time inside my head, where they rearranged themselves with a cruel and absolute clarity before I even wanted to understand them. The plan, the natural questions about the family's business, the attention he paid me, and now, that night, after everything that had happened between us, after that pause when he had looked at me as if I were real and important and enough, the words coming through the hallway carried an additional weight I hadn't expected to feel, one that made everything significantly brutally worse. I didn't hear anything more. Not because he had stopped talking. I realized later, much later, that the call was still going, but because there was a noise inside me that made every external sound completely irrelevant. That kind of noise doesn't have sound, but it has weight, temperature, and the specific texture of the ground disappearing beneath the feet of someone who had, for the first time in a long time, let their guard down entirely. I walked into the office. Alexei still had his back to me, phone in hand, his voice now too low for the words to reach me clearly. I went to the drawer where I kept the notebook, my notebook, with months of quiet investigation, with every inconsistency from the night Natasha died recorded with the precision of someone who knows that evidence without method is worth nothing. I took the notebook. I placed it on his desk, in the center, where it was impossible to miss, and I left. I didn't run. A Greco doesn't run. I picked up my bag in the bedroom with the movements of someone in complete control, which was, again, a lie I was telling my own body so it would keep functioning, and crossed the apartment toward the door without looking back once. Because if I looked back, I would see the room where I had been, for the first time in my life, completely happy for a few hours. And I couldn't afford to feel that right now, not with those words echoing and the entire ground disappearing, and my name and his voice still caught inside my chest like something I no longer knew what to do with. The door closed behind me with a click that was, somehow, the most definitive sound I had heard in a long time. The notebook contained everything, every date, every inconsistency, every line that didn't connect with the official version of what had happened to Natasha. Months of quiet work that led to a single conclusion. Marco Greco had never killed Natasha Volkov. I had spent months quietly gathering proof of my brother's innocence, and I had handed all of it to the man who had bought me as an instrument to destroy my own family, not because I was naive, but because it was the only way to say, without words, I was on the right side. The question is whether you were too. When the apartment fell empty and he finally turned around, phone in hand, and the call ended, what he found on the table wasn't just a notebook. It was the ground disappearing beneath his feet too. Chapter 6. He had never gone looking for anyone in his life. Irina didn't ask me anything when I opened her apartment door with the spare key I had borrowed 2 years ago and never returned. She just looked at me, looked at the bag on my shoulder, and said in the voice of someone already putting water on to boil, "The back bedroom is made up." I said thank you, and we both knew that word was carrying far more than it could hold. I stayed 3 days in Irina's apartment. I didn't go out, didn't answer messages, and spent a considerable amount of time staring at the ceiling thinking about absolutely nothing, which was, for someone like me, a significant effort. My brain kept insisting on processing. The words in the hallway, his expression when he talked about Natasha, the touch of hands on the table, the way those two things coexisted without my being able to reconcile them into any single version of reality that made sense. Irina brought me tea on the second day and sat on the edge of the bed with her own cup and an expression that meant "I'm here and I won't ask until you're ready to talk," which was her language of love and one I was fluent in. On the third day, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which, for Irina, was the equivalent of an athletic feat. And when I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds that she clearly used to choose her words with a care that wasn't typical of her. "You heard the part about the plan," she said finally. "I heard enough. Or you heard the beginning of a sentence and left before the period." She took a sip of tea with a calm that deeply irritated me. "Those are different things, Brianna." I didn't answer, but I didn't dismiss it either. And we both knew that too. He showed up on the 4th day. I knew it was him before Irina opened the door. Not from the sound, not for any concrete reason, but from the way my stomach reacted to the doorbell with a timing my brain was still catching up to. I stayed still in the chair with the laptop in my lap and waited. I heard Irina's voice, low, and with that specific tone of someone being polite to a person they aren't sure they like. I heard a reply in an even lower voice, and then I heard the door open wider, because Alexei Volkov didn't wait to be invited when he had decided to enter somewhere. That was a fact about him I knew well enough not to be surprised by. He stopped in the center of the room. I didn't immediately raise my eyes from the laptop. I needed 2 seconds to decide that pretending I hadn't noticed would be childish, and that Brianna Greco was not childish. And then I looked up with the composure of someone in complete control of the situation, which was, again, a lie I was telling my own nervous system. Alexei looked different. Not physically. The suit was impeccable. The posture was the same, but there was something around his eyes that signaled 3 days without sleep, with a clarity he probably hadn't intended to reveal and revealed anyway, because some things don't answer to anyone's control. "You left before I finished the sentence," he said. Irina had told him. His voice was low and completely direct. No preamble. No accusation, just the fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had spent 3 days organizing exactly what they wanted to say, and had arrived at the conclusion that this was the only sentence that mattered. "I heard enough," I repeated, the same answer I had given Irina, because it was true, and because I had no other. "You didn't hear the part that mattered." Silence. From the hallway came the sound of Irina picking something up in the kitchen with completely unnecessary focus. Then her footsteps moving toward the door. Then, in a voice perfectly audible to both of us, as if she were commenting on the weather, I desperately need some fresh air. I'll be outside for an undetermined amount of time. God bless this romantic disaster. The door closed. Alexei didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the room, and I stayed in the chair, and the distance between us was physical, and was also everything else that had accumulated over the last 3 days. He told me everything. The original plan, the decision to marry as an instrument of destroying the Grecos, to use the closeness between us to gather what he needed to expose the family and avenge Natasha. The call with his father that night, which had started exactly as I had heard it, and had ended with something I hadn't stayed to listen to. I can't go through with this. She has nothing to do with what they did. Father, I need to stop. I watched him as he spoke, with that ability I had developed over the years to not let my face show what was happening inside me, but my hands, resting on the laptop, had begun to tremble in a slight and completely uncontrollable way, and I realized it too late to do anything about it. He saw. Of course he saw, because Alexei always saw, but he said nothing. He simply stood there, eyes on my face, and that expression I had seen for the first time the night he had talked about Natasha, more bare than any other version of him, closer than I had planned to let him get. We didn't resolve things that afternoon. There was too much still in the air, too heavy to be dissolved in a single conversation, and we both knew that without needing to say it. But something happened in that small apartment, with Irina outside taking her unnecessary fresh air and Brianna Greco's hands trembling for the first time in front of another person, something that could no longer be undone. Chapter 7. She always knew her brother was innocent. What she didn't know yet was that the real culprit was far closer than any enemy. There is a difference between distrusting someone and accepting that person's help. I had spent the days after Irina's apartment drawing that distinction with almost surgical precision, because I needed it to exist in order to do what had to be done. Distrusting Alexei was legitimate. I had reason for it. I had heard the words, and the fact that he had said different things afterward didn't entirely erase the fact that the plan had existed. But accepting his help was a separate decision, made with my head and not my heart, based on a cold and direct assessment of the situation. I needed resources he had, and he had proven, with documents and not with words, that he was willing to put them at my disposal. That was how I set the terms. "You give me access to what I need," I said, one afternoon when the apartment was quiet, and the space between us still carried all the weight of the previous weeks, "and I accept the help. But what was between us stays out of it. No intimacy while the investigation is open." Alexei looked at me for a moment with that expression I still couldn't fully decode. It wasn't immediate agreement. It wasn't resistance. It was the look of someone weighing something that went beyond what had been said out loud. "Agreed," he said finally, and I knew, from the tone, that it had cost him more than he intended to reveal. We resumed working that same week. He opened files I wouldn't have been able to access on my own, internal Volkov records, communications that had been archived after Natasha's death, documents that existed behind layers of security that had taken years to build. I brought what I had already gathered, months of quiet analysis, every inconsistency cataloged, every detail that didn't line up with the official version marked with the precision of someone who knows that a single weak piece of evidence can destroy an entire case. When we laid everything on the same table for the first time, the size of the puzzle became clear. "The story never made sense," I said, running my finger through the notes and feeling the familiar weight of something I had carried alone for too long. The official report has 3 time gaps that were never explained. There's a financial transaction in the week before Natasha's death that was attributed to a ghost account and filed away as an accounting error. And there's a witness who gave a statement and then disappeared completely from the record 2 days later. Alexei was quiet while I spoke, his eyes moving through each document with that total focus he applied to everything. There was a tension in his jaw that I recognized now. It wasn't anger. It was the effort of someone processing information about something that hurts and refusing to let the pain interfere with their thinking. "Marco never had sufficient motive," he said finally, in a low voice. I knew that, but it was easier to believe the version I was handed than to investigate what was underneath it. I didn't respond, because there was truth in that, and because I understood better than anyone how grief can be used as a veil by those who want someone's pain to keep them from seeing too far. We worked for days. The condition I had established held, and Alexei respected it with a discipline I alternated between admiring and finding unsettling, because there were moments when our eyes met over the documents, and I felt the weight of everything being deliberately set aside. And in those moments I had to redirect my attention back to the files with a speed I hoped he didn't notice. He noticed. I knew he noticed, but neither of us said anything, and that shared silence had its own quality that was, in itself, a form of intimacy my condition hadn't managed to eliminate entirely. It was on a Wednesday night, with the files spread across the office table and the coffee cups cold for far too long, that the pattern began to emerge. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden revelation lit by a bolt of clarity. It was the kind of discovery that happens when two competent people work with enough focus for long enough. One thread pulling another, a date that doesn't match another, a name that appears once and then appears again in a completely different context, and then appears a third time in a place it has no business being. "Wait," I said, stopping mid-sentence about the financial transactions. Alexei looked up. I went back 3 pages, then 2 more. I aligned 2 documents we had analyzed separately and placed them side by side on the table, and what that juxtaposition revealed was so clear that I had to look a second time to make sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. I wasn't. The pattern was real. The same name appeared in the family's administrative authorizations in the month before Natasha's death. It appeared in the communications that had cleared access to the property where she had been found. It appeared in a payment record, filed as an operational expense that, when traced back to its source, led to no real vendor. It wasn't the name of an enemy. It was the name of someone who smiled at dinner tables, who showed up at the right moments with the right words, who had access to everything: the Grecos, the Volkovs, the business, the trust of people who had no apparent reason to doubt him. Someone who had always been close enough to everything that I hadn't noticed until now. The feeling was physical, a tightening in the center of my chest that wasn't quite pain, but was a close relative of it, the kind that surfaces when the mind confirms something the instinct had already tried to signal weeks earlier without my having been able to name it yet. The dinner, the lingering looks, the questions that had no reason to exist, the attention I had felt as wrong without being able to explain why. Now I could. Alexei noticed the shift in my face before I said anything. Of course he did, because he always did, and because he had learned to read me with a precision that still surprised me even now. "What is it?" he said, his voice low and completely controlled. I was quiet for a few seconds, not because I was uncertain about what I had found. The documents were too clear for reasonable doubt, but because naming it out loud would make it real in a way I was still processing, and because the implications of what I had discovered spread in directions I needed time to map. There were people who would be destroyed by this information. There were others who deserved to be. And there was one in particular who had spent all this time smiling at me with the confidence of someone who believes they will never be caught. I turned the laptop toward Alexei. On the screen were just 3 lines of information: dates, a name, a transfer that shouldn't exist. Enough for anyone with sufficient attention to reach the same conclusion I had reached. Alexei read, for a long moment, without speaking, without visibly reacting, just reading, rereading, connecting the dots with that quiet speed that was characteristic of him. Then he went still, and the silence that settled between us in that moment was heavy in a way that was different from all the other silences of that investigation. It was the silence of 2 people who had arrived at the same place at the same time, and who knew, without needing to say it, that what came next was going to change everything. He turned his eyes to me. "How long do you need to be certain?" I closed the laptop slowly. "Long enough to prove it," I replied. "Because when I take this forward, there can't be any margin." Alexei nodded once, with that firmness that made any further elaboration unnecessary. Then, after a moment in which I saw something cross his face that was older, and heavier than anything I had seen in him before, something that had Natasha's name written beneath it, invisible but present, he asked only one question, calm, cold, far more dangerous than any outburst of rage would have been. "Where is he right now?" Chapter 8. She was going after the killer. He was going after her. Because she is completely reckless, and he is completely lost. I knew Alexei wouldn't approve. That was exactly why I didn't say anything. The information had come through a channel I won't detail here, because Brianna Greco has her methods, and they work best when they remain solely hers. The fact was simple. The suspect would be attending a masquerade ball that night, in a venue I knew, among people who knew me from far enough away that a mask and a different dress were all I needed to move invisibly among them. Alexei was in a meeting when I left. I kept my location tracker on, not out of obedience, but because I'm not an idiot, and called a cab before anyone in the apartment had time to realize I had made a decision. The venue was exactly the kind of place that City used to hide dirty business behind expensive champagne and crystal chandeliers. Men in impeccable suits moved through the crowd with the ease of people who had frequented that environment since they learned to knot a tie, and the women accompanying them had that specific kind of presence that is cultivated over years of practice in looking like exactly enough without revealing anything beyond that. I fit in without difficulty. The dress was floor-length, deep teal, the kind that does the work without needing any extra effort. The mask covered enough, and I had pinned my hair differently than usual, which was, for anyone who only knew me from formal events, a small but effective change. No one recognized me. I moved through the room with the calm of someone simply enjoying the evening, keeping the suspect in my peripheral field of vision without ever looking directly at him, long enough to register as attention. I was cataloging behavior, interactions, who he spoke to, and for how long, and with what expression. It was going well, until I felt the hand at the small of my back. I recognized him before I turned around. It was physical, the same presence I had learned to recognize in an entire room without needing visual confirmation, which occupied the space around it, in a way no other man in that venue could replicate. Alexei was beside me with a glass in hand, and the expression of someone having a completely casual conversation, which was the exact opposite of what his eyes were communicating. His jaw was slightly set. The smile he directed at the room was polished and absolutely cold. "You got here fast," I said, without turning fully toward him. "You left the tracker on," he replied, his voice low and close enough that only I could hear. "I took it as an invitation." "You read it wrong." "Probably." He didn't leave. The hand stayed where it was, light, firm, on the line between guidance and possessiveness, and I decided that fighting it at that moment would be more conspicuous than simply accepting it, which was, of course, exactly what he had calculated. The problem started when a man I didn't know approached with that specific smile of someone who had spotted a woman alone and decided that was an invitation. He asked for a dance with the confidence of someone who rarely hears no. I accepted, not out of interest, but because the dance floor gave me the best angle to watch the suspect, not because I wanted to dance with him, but because on the other side of the room, the suspect had just moved toward a group I needed to observe, and being on the dance floor gave me a sightline that my previous position hadn't. And also, perhaps, just perhaps, because I had felt Alexei's hand on my back, and its warmth had reminded me of things I had promised myself to set aside for now, and provoking him seemed, in that moment, a reasonable way to redirect that energy. His expression when I accepted the stranger's hand was a masterwork of absolute restraint. We danced. I kept my attention on the suspect while pretending to pay attention to my partner, who was saying something about wine I wasn't processing, and everything was going exactly as needed until the stranger was gently, unambiguously, and with a courtesy that left no room for argument removed from my arms. Alexei took his place with the naturalness of someone simply correcting a logistical misunderstanding. His hand closed around my waist with a firmness that was different from the calculated neutrality of before. There was something possessive in that touch he wasn't bothering to conceal, and the closeness between our bodies as we began to move was the kind that the choreography didn't require, but that neither of us did anything to reduce. "You were being watched," he said, his voice low and rough near my ear. "I was doing the watching," I corrected, my heart at a pace I preferred not to analyze in detail. Both can be true at the same time. His cologne was too familiar, the hand holding mine was too warm, and the fact that I had promised myself to keep my distance was becoming, with every beat, a progressively harder promise to keep. Across the room, the suspect was watching us. I noticed before Alexei did, the look that crossed the room and landed on us with an attention that was, in the first seconds, mere curiosity, and then transformed into something more calculated as he studied us more carefully. The moment something changed in his face, the exact instant he shifted from an uninterested spectator to someone who had just recognized what he was looking at. The music ended. Alexei and I left the venue together without exchanging a word, and the silence between us was as loaded as any argument we could have had. That night, back at the apartment, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. No identification, no context. Just one short line that I read twice before fully understanding what it meant. "I know what you're looking for, and I know you're getting close." I stood motionless with the phone in my hand. Someone knew I was investigating, and wanted me to know they knew. Chapter 9. She went too far. He arrived too late, but not late enough. And now the only bridge to the truth is dead on the floor. I didn't sleep that night. The message stayed on my phone screen longer than it should have, and I read it more times than was useful, as if one more read would reveal some detail the previous ones had missed. It didn't. It was what it was. Short, direct, and designed to produce exactly the effect it produced. The feeling that I had been moving across a board someone was watching from above, with a view of the game I still didn't have. I showed it to Alexei. He read it once, set the phone on the table, and was quiet for a moment with that expression I had learned to recognize as contained anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that hardens, that organizes itself into something cold and functional, and far more dangerous than any outburst. "You don't move alone from here on," he said. "I hear you," I replied, careful not to say I agree, because there was an important distinction between the two, and I needed it to keep existing. He looked at me. He knew the distinction too. The days that followed were methodical analysis and tense silence, and coffee in quantities no doctor would approve. I had gone back to the Greco family financial reports, not the ones I already knew, but the older ones, going back years before anything I had investigated up until then. Because if there was a pattern, it hadn't started recently, and old patterns leave trails that people tend to stop hiding after they believe they've become safe. It was in those reports that I found the name. Not directly, never directly, because whoever builds that kind of scheme over years learns that the proper name is the first element to be removed from any compromising record. But there was an account. An account that appeared repeatedly over nearly a decade, in transactions small enough not to trigger alerts but frequent enough to accumulate. Over time, a volume that was impossible to justify as operational. And when I traced the account back to its source, with a patience that cost me 2 full days, and a considerable amount of resources I won't detail here, what I found wasn't a shell company or a fictitious vendor. It was an employee, a man who had worked for the family for years, appearing in the administrative records with the specific invisibility of someone who had been blending into the background slowly enough that no one really saw him anymore. He was in the security files from Greco family events. He was in the access authorizations for the property where Natasha had been found. He was at every point in the timeline I had built over the past months, always in a lateral position, always as someone who had merely approved or signed or cleared, never the protagonist, always the infrastructure, the kind of person who does someone else's dirty work and believes that makes them invisible. I needed to speak with him. Alexei was in a meeting when I found the address of the storage facility where some of the family's oldest files had been kept, the kind of place that exists in the records as a storage expense and that no one visits because no one remembers it exists. It was the kind of place where someone who wanted to hide physical documents, knowing the digital ones were being monitored, might have stored exactly what I was looking for. I sent my location to Alexei before leaving. I left the phone call open in silence with the audio active, as a precaution I hoped would be unnecessary. I went anyway, not because I was reckless, but because there was a window of time, and I had learned, over months of investigation, that windows of time don't wait for circumstances to be perfect before closing. The storage facility was in a part of the city that wasn't exactly dangerous, but wasn't the kind of place that appeared on anyone's itinerary either. The exterior was unremarkable, a mid-size warehouse among other mid-size warehouses, with the look of something that existed functionally and had no intention of existing in any other way. The door was unlocked. That should have been enough for me to turn back. I know that. But there were documents inside that I had tracked down with 2 days of work, and an unlocked door could mean carelessness just as easily as it could mean a trap, and I had come too far to let myself be stopped by a possibility that wasn't yet a certainty. I went in. The interior was exactly what I had imagined. Rows of shelves with boxes organized by year, most with faded labels and the specific smell of paper that had been kept in an enclosed space for too long. I found what I was looking for in the 3rd row, a box with a date that matched the period I had identified in the reports, with documents that confirmed, in physical paper with original signatures, each of the transactions I had tracked digitally. I was photographing the last document when I heard the footsteps. He was exactly as I had imagined he would be, the kind of man that memory registers as background, without features distinctive enough to set him apart from any environment. Gray at the temples, shoulders slightly rounded, the posture of someone who had spent decades being overlooked and had turned it into a tool. He looked at me with the calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment. "Miss Greco," he said, in a voice that was too neutral to be genuinely neutral. I knew it was only a matter of time. I kept my composure. I pocketed my phone with the most natural gesture I could manage and crossed my arms, because I needed my hands to stay still, and crossing my arms was the most discreet way to ensure that. "You knew I'd be here?" I asked, in the tone of someone simply confirming a piece of information. "I knew when you started pulling the old records." He walked slowly between the shelves with no particular urgency, like someone navigating a familiar space. "You're very good at what you do, but you leave traces in the systems when you're in a hurry. I made a mental note about that for later. You were present the night Natasha Volkov died," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You authorized access to the property. You processed the payments that funded what happened there." He didn't deny it. He looked at me with an expression that was almost admiration, and also something else that took me a second to identify as fear disguised as control. "I did what I was asked to do," he said finally, and that was when I understood, because whoever plans a murder knows the motive. They carry the logic behind every decision, holding the justification as part of the weight of the choice. But this man was telling me he had done what someone asked, and the way he said it wasn't the defense of someone who made the wrong choice. It was the confession of someone who had never had a choice because he had never been the mind behind anything. He was the executor, not the architect. The real person responsible was still somewhere else, and this man was the only direct link I had to reach them. I opened my mouth to continue. The storage door exploded open. Alexei entered with a speed that didn't match the calm he projected in every other context of his life. And there was an expression on his face I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the usual coldness. It was something prior to all of that, more instinctive and more honest, and it lasted only the second in which his eyes found mine and confirmed I was in one piece. The man drew his weapon in the same instant. Alexei fired first. The sound was dry and final, and the silence that followed had a different quality from any silence that had come before in that warehouse. The man fell between the shelves, and the documents I had photographed were still in my phone's memory, and the only direct link to whoever had ordered Natasha's death was lying dead on the concrete floor 3 meters away from me. Alexei reached me in 2 steps, and his hands landed on my arms with a firmness that was verification and not restraint, moving from shoulder to elbow like someone confirming through touch that nothing is broken. "Did he say anything?" he asked, his voice low and completely controlled, eyes still on my face. I took one deep breath. "Enough for me to know it wasn't him," I replied, "but not enough for me to know who it is." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but in that second, I saw on Alexei's face the same conclusion I had reached, that we were closer than ever, and that whoever was on the other side of this knew it, and that the time we had before that person made a drastic decision was getting shorter by the hour. We left the warehouse together with the photographed documents, a dead lead on the floor, and the absolute certainty that the real person responsible was still out there somewhere, with a familiar face, a trustworthy smile, and the knowledge that we were closing in. Chapter 10. They finally reached each other. But the war isn't over yet, because the enemy is still inside the house. The table was set for 10 people, and for the first time no one seemed to expect that dinner to end in confrontation. Viktor Volkov arrived before the Grecos, which I read as a deliberate choice. The move of someone who wants to demonstrate they don't need a positional advantage because they've reached a conclusion that dispenses with strategy. He was older than I had imagined, with the posture of a man who had carried power long enough for it to become part of the structure of his body, and his eyes were an older version of Alexei's, the same precision, the same temperature, with more layers of history beneath them. When my father walked in with Marco at his side, the silence that settled lasted only a second, but it was the kind of second that holds a great deal. Victor stood up. He extended his hand to Marco. Marco looked at that hand for a moment, and I saw in my brother's face the weight of 2 years of accusation, of isolation, of carrying a guilt that had never been his with the resignation of someone who no longer had the energy to keep denying it. And then he shook Victor's hand with a firmness that made me hold my breath. There was no speech. There didn't need to be. I looked at Alexei across the table. He was looking at me. The dinner was quiet at first. The kind of quiet that exists when people who have spent years on opposite sides of something enormous need to learn, in real time, how to occupy the same space without every gesture being read as a threat. But the quiet gave way gradually, the way it always does when there is warm food and real exhaustion, and the absence, finally, of a concrete reason to keep your guard up. Marco was quiet for most of the night. He had been like that since Natasha's death, more closed off, more somber, as if part of him had been filed away along with the grief, and he hadn't yet found the key to retrieve it. But at a certain point, when Victor said something about Natasha in a low voice, not an accusation, just a memory, the kind of thing you say when you've decided a person deserves to be remembered out loud, Marco looked up and responded. A short sentence, but he responded, and Victor listened. I had to look away for a few seconds because there were things happening on my face that I preferred to process in private. Later, after the families had been gradually dispersing with the slowness of people in no hurry to leave, the apartment fell quiet in a way that was different from usual. It was the silence of afterward, after the tension, after the formality, after something that had taken too long to happen and had finally happened. I was in the office when Alexei came in. It was the same office, the same desk where I had left the notebook weeks earlier and walked out without looking back, the same low light from the lamp in the corner, and there was something deliberate in his choice to find me here, in this specific place, that I recognized before he even opened his mouth. He stopped near the door for a moment, as if confirming I wasn't going to leave before he finished. Then he walked to the center of the room with that calm that had stopped intimidating me, and had become, at some point, I hadn't monitored precisely enough, something I simply associated with him, with the specific way Alexei Volkov occupied the world. "You left before I finished the sentence," he said, the same words, the same tone. But this time there was something different beneath them. Not the urgency of 3 sleepless days in Irina's apartment, but something more settled, more certain of itself, like someone who had reached a conclusion after enough time to be sure it wasn't going to change. I held my breath. "I want to finish it now," he continued, and he did. No long speech, no calculated elaboration of the kind I had learned to associate with the way he handled anything that mattered to him. Just the truth, delivered with the directness of someone who had decided that the right words don't need ornamentation to get where they need to go, that I had changed everything, that the plan had stopped, not because it became inconvenient, but because he had looked at me and understood that there was a fundamental distinction between the Greco family as a concept and Brianna Greco as a person, and that this distinction made the original plan something he could no longer sustain, without it costing something he wasn't willing to pay, that almost losing me had made everything else stop mattering, with a clarity he hadn't anticipated, and couldn't undo. I listened to all of it, without interrupting, without the habitual filter of skepticism I applied to anything that got too close to something I wanted to believe. I simply listened, with my hands still at my sides, and my heart at a pace I had stopped trying to control. When he finished, The silence lasted only a second. Then I stepped forward. The kiss wasn't gentle. This wasn't the moment for gentleness. It was the moment for everything that had been held back through weeks of calculated distance and established conditions, and the exhausting discipline of being near someone and pretending that proximity cost nothing. There were months of tension in that kiss, and the anger of having heard the wrong half of the conversation, and the relief of having heard the half that mattered, and the rainy night from Chapter 5 that I had tried to file away, and that was completely unfiled in that moment. His hand was on my face, and mine was at his collar, and neither of us made any movement toward pulling back. The office door opened. Irina appeared with a cup of tea in hand, and the expression of someone who had just processed unexpected information at an admirable speed. She stood perfectly still for exactly 1 second, then took a step back, then closed the door with a delicacy that was completely out of character for her. From outside, in a voice perfectly audible to both of us, "Carry on." I saw absolutely nothing. God bless this romantic disaster once and for all. I laughed. It was a real laugh. Short, involuntary, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it. And how long had it been since I laughed like that? Without weight, without calculation, without the layer of control I applied to anything that involved any real vulnerability. Alexei didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth appeared, that rare movement I had learned to collect, because it happened so seldom that each occurrence had its own value. He pressed his forehead to mine, and we stayed like that for a moment that needed nothing more. That night, after the apartment had gone truly quiet, I opened my laptop intending to review the files I had photographed at the warehouse. Work, routine, the kind of activity that organizes the mind when too many things are occupying space at once. I opened the first folder and stopped. There was a file I hadn't opened yet, smaller than the others, without a clear label, the kind that goes unnoticed precisely because it doesn't seem important enough to warrant immediate attention. I opened it. It was a transfer, a single transfer, on a specific date, with an amount that wasn't large enough to trigger an alert, but that I recognized immediately because I had spent weeks looking at similar numbers. But it wasn't the amount that made me stop. It was the name. I stared at the screen for a stretch of time I can't measure, with that familiar sensation of the ground disappearing, but different this time, colder, because this time I wasn't surprised in a way that paralyzes. I was surprised in a way that organizes, that catalogs, that immediately begins calculating what comes next, because the name in that file wasn't that of a declared enemy. It wasn't someone I had learned to distrust over the course of the investigation. It was someone who had smiled at me that week, who had been present at every critical point in the story, always with a reasonable explanation, always with the right face for the right context, someone the entire family trusted. I closed the laptop slowly, took one deep breath. I need more proof, I thought, with a clarity that came from a cold and functional place inside me, that exhaustion and the happiness of the last few hours hadn't managed to fully shut down. Because if I'm right, and I am, no one is going to believe me without it. Well, that was the story, and as you've probably guessed, it doesn't end there. The good news is that Part 2 is already out. To access Part 2 and see how the story continues, it's super simple. Just click the first link in the pinned comment below. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click the very first link down in the comments, and Part 2 will be right there waiting for you. It's that easy. I'm Lena, and I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Just click the link in the first pinned comment.